This is Mark is Read, a podcast devoted to discovering, reading, and obsessing over books. I'm your host, Taylor Neary. Let's get into it. Season 4, Episode 4, The Lion Women of Tehran by Marian Kamali. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Mark is Read. I know it's been a little bit since our last episode, and just a little information, I guess. I normally really don't like taking breaks during the season. The fact that there's an episode every week or every other week is something that really helps motivate me in general and helps provide some framework so that the podcast actually happens versus just falling onto the back burner. But the last couple of weeks, really the last 2 months, I've been doing a lot of traveling, a lot of bookstore visiting, and just needed a little bit of time to recover. And I really wanted to be at my best for y'all before talking about this book, especially because I enjoyed this book so much, and I actually finished it on one of my travels and had a lot of time to think about it while we were traveling, and I really wanted to be in the right frame of mind to be able to talk about it. And for me, that doesn't mean, feeling a type of way or anything like that, but just being in the right headspace to be able to talk about a book. And I have been so worn out from all of my travels lately that I really haven't been in that spot. So that's why we took a little bit of a break, but now we're back and I'm feeling re-energized and really excited about some of the books that I want to talk about with y'all this season and just where the podcast is going this season and all of that. And so yeah, we're back. And we're talking about The Lion Women of Tehran. And this is definitely a book that a lot of people recommended to me and is something that I think people typically would think is something that's in my wheelhouse, just because it is historical fiction and talking about major historical events through this lens of storytelling through these individuals, which is something I love. But for some reason, when I was first reading about this book, I really had a hard time connecting with it and feeling like it was something that I wanted to do here. And I really didn't feel like I had enough, knowledge to be able to talk about this book in a smart, respectful way. But finally, someone recommended it to me again for about the millionth time, and I decided to just go for it. And I'm really glad I did, because it's such a wonderful book and so beautifully written and so interesting in terms of the history as well, and just the history of the Middle East and Iran especially, but also during this time period, kind of the 1950s to present, is just not a period that I'm super familiar with in general. I mean, you guys know that I definitely have an interest in World War II history, but other than that, a lot of my, academic learning and just general interest through my research and other things has been in the 15 and 1600s. So very much in a different time period. And so it's not so much that I'm not interested in this period, it's just that I haven't really been exposed to it. And this book really exposed me to it and then led me to buy a couple books about Iran during this period, to listen to a couple podcasts, and to really start to actively work on expanding my knowledge of this area and this culture, and not only the history of it, but also, culturally and society-wise, what's happening there now. So as I mentioned, it's very much storytelling of the cultural and political shift in Iran between these two women, Ellie and Homa. And just going to say this now, I probably am going to mispronounce a lot during this episode, and I'm very, very, very sorry. Please tell me how to correctly pronounce everything in the comments. Would love to hear that. But one of kind of the pitfalls of reading a physical book versus listening to it is that the pronunciation is just how I'm guessing it's pronounced. I think this really came true during Throne of Glass when I said Chowl the whole time I was reading Throne of Glass, and it's 100% Kale. And I know that. I've been told that. My mom is listening to them on tape and told me that that's how they're pronounced. And it's still a struggle for me to say Kale versus Chowl, which clearly his name is not Chowl, but that's just how my brain pronounces things. So, just like equal opportunity mispronunciation here. But just in general, for those of you who have not read this book, I don't think we're really going to get into like specific spoilers or anything, so you definitely can listen to this and then read the book. But for those of you who haven't read it and are interested in it or just don't know anything about it, the kind of setup for it and the structure of the book really reminded me of Island of Sea Women, which we read that way back in season 1. Y'all know how much I love Lisa C. She does that a lot with her books of focusing on a couple people throughout their life and showing kind of the difference in growth in relationships and looking at those individuals, but then using that as a setting to then talk about these bigger historical issues. And that's really what happened. This is not like a historical fiction, like nonfiction kind of book. Like we are not going from like this event led to this event led to this event kind of thing. It's very much looking at these two women who you meet them when they are in elementary school. They are from two different socioeconomic classes, very different home lives and family dynamics. And you're watching them throughout their lives and seeing not only how they are growing as individuals and how their relationship shifts and evolves, but also seeing how growing up, they are born in the 50s and 60s and like growing up during that time period. So they're under the Shah, they are in college during the revolution, and then start to see the changes that the Ayatollah and that political organization that is now controlling Iran, like the changes that it made to society and politics and just their day-to-day lives. And there's the implication that it's changing everything across the country, but you see it more through these two individuals' lived experiences. And I think for me, at least, that's such a compelling way to deliver a historical narrative, especially when you're trying to cover so much. Just in terms of like historical events, this book covers so much stuff. You get the entire revolution, you get issues under the Shah, you get issues under the Ayatollah, you get all of this. And that would be so dense and hard to get through if you were looking at it from just like this bigger political lens and looking at every single little event. Just getting through all of that would take an 1,000-page book and would be really hard to get through, I think. But when you're reading about it like this, first of all, I think it's more relatable as someone who has not lived in Iran, was not alive during most of these events, does not know what it's like to live in a very religious, restrictive society. But you're hearing about it from an individual and their, just like how things shifted between like their being able to buy different types of clothing or having to wear hijab or not, and choices that they're making and abilities that they have to go to school and get a job or not. And that is so much more relatable when it's on that one-on-one level, I think, than when you're looking at it from a huge bird's eye society view. And I think it makes it so interesting and just like easy to digest in terms of a completely different culture and a completely different existence than maybe what you are experiencing. So you get all of that political happenstance in the background, then you also get these class and economic differences between the two girls. I say class and economic differences because, even at the beginning of the book, Ellie and her mom, her dad has just died, and they are in trouble financially and like in a very different situation, but her mom is very much like, we are of a higher class even though we are here right now, and that's very much a factor in Ellie's home life. And you see how Homa does not really deal with that kind of stuff, but is dealing with the implications of that and the impact of that from the people around her. And then you're also getting this kind of like royalist versus communist ideas. Homa's father is a communist and is very open and vocal about that. And so Homa grows up in a home where you talk about politics very openly in a way that Ellie's family does not really do. And then Homa becomes very much an activist and very outspoken about her political beliefs. And you definitely see this as the book goes on, but Ellie doesn't really know where she falls on any of those ideas and is still trying to figure that out, just like a lot of people are in college, but struggles, I think, kind of to get there, and then struggles to stand up for what she believes because she doesn't necessarily grow up in that familial situation where it's okay to talk about things like that. And you really see kind of this dynamic of those bigger political groups and ideas, but also how they work on an individual level. And I think that that's something that really hit me, especially when you're reading from Ellie's perspective, especially later in the book where, spoiler alert here, maybe pause if you don't want spoilers, but Ellie inadvertently ends up revealing that Homa is working in these protests and things like that to someone who works for the government and who ends up arresting Homa and sending her to prison, and that kind of snowballs into all of these bigger things. And Ellie doesn't mean to turn in Homa in this way, but she just doesn't have the situational awareness to realize that it's not safe to talk about those things. And even though this is someone who's in their like social circle, it's not okay to talk about it. And, you know, like she doesn't necessarily agree with everything Homa is doing, and definitely has issues separating like the bigger political revolution resistance group that Homa is involved in from Homa the individual. Like she loves Homa the individual, but struggles to kind of like understand those two sides of her. And I think that that's very interesting, especially in all of the political turmoil that is going on around the world right now, of understanding that, you know, like you can love an individual and that they're not fully defined by their political allegiance or something like that, but also, you know, those bigger political groups, it's not just like these big bird's eye view ideas, it's also made up of all of these individuals that might be just like the person who you care about. And so kind of making those broad sweeping statements about, you know, activism or political groups or anything like that is hard to do because it's not just kind of this like monolithic group. There are these, it's made up of individuals, and those ideas come through. So that was really interesting for me. And then one of the other like main themes and plot lines throughout the book is just like the concept of feminism in general in this time period, and also in Iran. Homa especially is very determined to have equal rights and to be able to do things equally and to be able to go to school and potentially become an attorney and things like this. And you see Ellie kind of struggling with that as she's in this class and social situation where she's kind of expected just to marry well and then to be at home, and kind of struggle with the idea that there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but also there should be this opportunity for, if you don't want to do that, you can do other things and you can have a job and things like that. And then it's also, you know, it's looking at it through access to education, access to jobs, access to independence, those kinds of things. But then is also reflected in how strict the clothing restrictions are by the society, and like how hijab starts to become more of a requirement, and how in the beginning of the book, when they're younger, there's all of this freedom of expression in terms of what you wear and how you wear clothes, and how, conservative or not you are in your dress as a woman, and how those options are really limited throughout the book, and how that kind of mirrors how opportunities are being limited for women in this society. So really, really, really interesting, just like beautifully written, and also you really end up connecting with all the characters. I think it's very easy, especially as an American millennial, to relate very easily to Homa as this person who wants all of these rights and access and doesn't understand why she wouldn't have access to those things. But the book is written mostly from Ellie's perspective, and I think that was a really smart writer's choice, because Ellie is someone who you tend to be more critical of, I think, or I at least tended to be more critical of Ellie, just because she is kind of naive. She does live in this very protected bubble, that she just doesn't have this exposure to challenges that lots of other people are dealing with. But because it's from her perspective, you do understand where she's coming from a lot more and have a lot more empathy for her. And I think that makes it really good just as a book, because the character who you are more easily able to empathize with as a 2025 woman is not actually the narrator. And so you end up developing this empathy for all of the characters and kind of understanding where people are coming from, even if you don't agree with them and think that they're making mistakes. And that's not an easy thing to do, I don't think, as a writer. And I think that this one is so beautifully done and just really lovely. And there are definitely points that are really hard to read in this book. I will not shy away from that. There are definitely trigger warnings. I don't want to spoil anything. If you are concerned about reading it and want to know about the trigger warnings, I'm happy to answer any questions. If you don't, then, do whatever you need to do for your mental health. There are definitely some heavy scenes in this book, and some things that end up affecting these women's lives forever. And I think they're written in a way that is very respectful and just really well done. And it's one of those books that it kind of similar to Island of Sea Women again. I felt a lot of connections between these two books and felt similar ways when reading both, where it's hard to get through at points, but it's something that feels like it's important to kind of read and bear witness to, and kind of not feel good about it and leave certain chapters and be upset, because this is something that happened to people. Even if these two people don't necessarily exist, their stories are very easy to identify and to be able to see among tons of people who have lived in Iran over the past decades. And so while their exact story might not have happened, reading it is kind of creating the space for those stories that people maybe weren't able or weren't willing to share. And I think that that's really important, and really important to talk about it and to feel that discomfort, and then be able to hopefully learn from it or keep talking about it so that it can be prevented, and hopefully in the future. But before I wrap anything up, one of the podcasts that I listened to, I listened to probably 5 years ago. And as I was reading this book, it kept making me think about this podcast that I listened to 5 years ago. So I decided to re-listen to it. And it's a mini series called Pink Card. It's part of 30 for 30 on ESPN, but it's not what you're probably immediately thinking of. It's actually produced by Megan Rapinoe and Sue Bird, and it's this Iranian American journalist goes and looks at kind of the same period of history, but through the lens of soccer and women's ability to be in soccer stadiums. And the ability to actually go and watch soccer games kind of became emblematic of the resistance movement in Iran, because that ability was very much taken away and has been a big form of protest for women in Iran to cheer for sporting events, to sneak into soccer games dressed as men, things like that. So it really does pair very well with this book. And I actually think there are some characters that are almost like very much mirror the mom of the journalist who is brought on and is interviewed. She interviews a lot of different women, but is probably between Homa and Ellie, and then Homa's daughter Bahar's age-wise. She is in probably like high school when the revolution happens and ends up leaving Iran to continue her education. And episode 2 specifically of the podcast is very similar to the book in many ways. There is one figure within this women's movement in Iran who really has a lot of similarities with Homa as a character, just in terms of what they believe in and the actions that they're taking. So as you guys know, whenever I read a historical fiction book, I love to then do some research and see, like actual nonfiction stories about it. And this podcast, I think, is a great companion for this book to look at this similar time period and events from kind of this perspective of being a fan of soccer, which is really cool. And it looks at these women who started protesting in the late 70s and 80s up to women who are like in their 20s now and have just started joining these protests. And it's very, very inspirational and also very heavy and very serious and hard to listen to, but really does provide kind of these real life stories that really mirror the book in a really beautiful, cool way. So I would highly recommend the book, but I also would highly recommend the podcast. I think it's only 5 or 6 episodes, so it's really not a huge deal. Again, it's called Pink Card. I will make sure to include it in the show notes and the Substack email that will go out about this episode, but definitely a fun companion to have in addition to the book. So I'm going to wrap up our conversation there. Next week, we are going to be talking about The Serpent and the Wings of Night by Carissa Broadbent. I am very excited to talk about this book with you guys, as I have been waiting to talk about it so that I can finally read the sequel. And I think that's going to be great. And then we're going to have couple episodes that are all books that I bought while I was traveling, and I can't wait to share them with you. Some of them are definitely ones that I've never heard of and hadn't really heard of before and weren't really popular on Bookstagram or Book Talk or anything like that. So hopefully can introduce you guys to some new books. In the meantime, as always, let's talk about other things I'm reading, listening, and watching. So first of all, things that I'm watching. My husband and I just watched Avenue 5, which is a futuristic show. Hugh Laurie is the main character, so obviously it's going to be great. And they are on a spaceship that's basically like a cruise ship, and they get knocked off course and are going to be delayed returning to Earth. And that is the basis of the show. It's really cute. It's only 1 season. It's very much... It kind of has similar humor pieces, I think, to The Office, and that like it is kind of British humor based, where there's like this funny physical comedy, there's jokes, things like that. But then they also cover these really serious issues, but they do so in a very human way that ends up being very entertaining. And it's a very cute show that I would highly recommend. Then things that I'm listening to, like I said, I just finished this podcast, Pink Card. And even if you don't end up reading this book, I highly recommend the podcast. It's so well done. It's so interesting. And 5 years later, I still think about it all the time and tell people to listen to it all the time. And I think that's always the hallmark of a good, movie, podcast, TV show, book, something that makes you think about it all of the time, even when you haven't listened to it or read it or watched it in years, and something that you want people around you to also experience. And then finally, things that I'm reading. One of my trips recently ended up in Dublin in Ireland, which I had never been to before. And I realized when we were there that I knew very little about Irish history, and I have been reading a bunch of different Irish history books. And I'm going to be including at least 2 of them in our nonfiction episode coming up later this season, but stay tuned for those. And if you have any Irish history recommendations, I would love to hear them. Other than that, I've just been reading books for y'all and avoiding reality by reading romance books. You know, great things. So I'm going to leave it there, and I will see you guys next week for Serpent and the Wings of Night. Bye for now.
This has been Mark is Read. Thank you for listening. Please rate, review, and share the podcast, as that is how people find us. Email markasreadpod@gmail.com to suggest books, and subscribe to the newsletter at markasreadpod.substack.com. See you next time, and enjoy a week of reading.